Shut up and sit down.
Hey everybody.
Hey guys. So my dad, both my parents were older parents growing up. They had me and my two sisters when they were in their 40s, and so we grew up with older parents than it seemed like all my friends. And but even though I didn't have a horrible relationship with my dad, he was never abusive, or I was never even spanked, probably because I was perfect, but whatever. So anyway, it was always a difficult relationship. Me and my dad, and maybe actually my dad and everybody he knew, had a difficult relationship with him. He just was not an easy guy to get along with. I think most of the time he dealt with his own demons. I think he was very unhappy with his life. He felt like maybe he was dealt a raw deal, and there was a lot of anger and bitterness and regret in him. I think he also maybe fought a little bit with an addictive personality, dealing with some addictions here and there, overcoming them, and then losing the battle once in a while, that kind of thing. So he just was a difficult man. He died about 15 years ago, and I can say, though, looking back, as hard as it was, especially as I grew into my own adulthood and having my own opinions and my own life, I can say that at the end of our relationship, we kind of made things okay. And I know that you, Chris, helped us with that. Like you sought that you guys never had a great relationship, but you sought to have some type of closure with him, right?
Right. I think in a lot of ways it would be easy for you and your family, and even me entering into your family, to be angry with him for the rest of our life. I mean, he did enough things to justify that kind of anger. And while he didn't physically abuse, it could easily be argued that some of his words were very verbally abusive.
Right.
And so I think it's important not to minimize that. To be honest, some of my earliest remembrances of him were basically him coddling and caring for his dogs and having no tolerance for his children. Like, he loved his dogs more than it seemed like he loved his family. And then obviously I think it would be easy for me to understand as a father why he was not so pleased with me, but he spent a lot of time being unhappy, I think, with me for the majority of our relationship.
Right, I guess it is true to think that, what is it, hindsight oftentimes is rose-colored glasses.
2020, hindsight is 2020.
But it's this rose-colored glasses idea that we look back sometimes and we remember the better things more than we remember the difficult times. So I could easily rose-color the history that we had with my dad. But I think in the end, we came to some type of an agreement, some kind of peace, basically.
Right.
I remember sitting when he was in the hospital room, and we worried mostly about his soul more than anything. And and I just remember just having this peaceful moment with him, and he says, I'm okay.
Right. I remember that too. And actually what's interesting is that while that was near the end of his life, I think we had tried numerous times throughout the whole relationship to come to a peaceful place, or at least a place where there was not going to be a battle. So we had almost like a peace agreement that we could somehow figure out a way to tolerate each other for a little bit of time. But there was always that little kind of word that was coming from other sources that he was resentful or angry at this or that. I mean, there was always an opportunity to be angry with him, is what I'm saying. But it was fascinating to see, though, how both of our hearts had turned with all of that reason to be angry, and to recognize, what, as he gets ready to enter into eternity, there's no desire for the holding on of a hard feeling. There was a desire that he could find peace. And with that, in a lot of ways, I felt like we let a lot of things go because we realized it's just not that important to hang on to.
Right. And so here we are 15 years past his passing.
Yep.
And that there is no regret in either one of us for the effort that we put in to find reconciliation in that relationship. I'm grateful that I tried. I'm grateful that at the end I felt like there was some form of peace there between us. And I have friends, and we've seen other relationships where there's a bitterness with a family member, with a parent, that is there's a refusal to let things go, a refusal to forgive and to seek reconciliation with that parent. And I think that I'm so glad that we did that, so I don't have to live in a regret. And I wish that these people, these friends of mine, would consider that when this parent passes, they're going to wish they at least made an attempt at reconciliation with them. And so that's what we want to talk about today is reconciliation with parents when there's a lot of times so much hurt, so much neglect and abuse even, and injury to us as children of these adults. And how do we deal with this? And is there really a benefit in reconciliation? Not even in my case with my dad, even though we didn't end his life with us frolicking off in the distance together with a happy relationship, but still I'm at peace with how we did end the time together. Yeah. But for you, the benefit, your dad is still alive, and even more so, the benefit of the effort you've put into a relationship with him, and how much that's added to your life.
Right. I think I have no regrets for all of the effort that both my father and I have put into trying to heal some deep wounds. I think that's why it's so important to be at least honest about the wounds and to be honest about how difficult it was, because without that honesty, then it would just be almost seemingly an insignificant effort to then, be reconciled. But some of these chasms and difficulties between parents and children, it's so deep and filled with, regrets and wounds and anger and frustrations that it just would be ultimately a miracle for there to be any type of, bridge. And I think ultimately that's in both cases, whether it was you with your father and even me with my father, I think that ultimately there was a lot of miracles that seemed to happen. So don't minimize the difficulty and the struggle. One of my first remembrances of me meeting your father was, I think I was trying to figure out a way to take you out, and he was, of course, being argumentative and not really wanting you to go out, and we were not clicking well, and at one point he said something like, "I could still kick your ass." And I, being such an amazing boyfriend at the time, looked at him and said, "You can't even reach my ass with your foot, let alone kick it," which is not the way to respond to a possible father-in-law.
17-year-old punk.
I was. So I didn't really set myself up for a great relationship with him. But what was interesting, though, is that I think what was interesting is this idea of letting go of the things that justifiably allow for you to have an anger and a frustration. So I want to talk about that for a second, because if we're saying you don't have to minimize the hurt and the frustration and the anger, if we're saying that it's important to even acknowledge that and to be honest about how difficult it's been, what do? Well, here's what you have to realize. I don't think there was ever going to be a time that we would explain to Gilbert, "Hey, this is what you're doing. This is how you're hurting your family. This is what you're saying that is causing your grandchildren to be frustrated or even to be scared around you." And him to say, "Oh, you're right."
Right.
That would never happen.
No.
And so in some ways, what we had to realize is that let's be careful about let's control what we can about the situation. Let's leave when there's difficulties. Right. And at the end of his life, when we sat there next to his bedside, I think ultimately what we realized, we can let go his anger and his harsh tone and even the hurtful things that he said, because he's getting ready to meet his maker. And ultimately, I think what we realize is that the more that we hold on to that bitterness and angerness individually, all it does is hurt ourselves.
Right. I think what we ultimately wanted in that moment was peace for him eternally. Yeah. We wanted eternal peace for him, and so we had to forgive and let go of things and hope for his eternal peace and his eternal salvation is what we wanted.
Right.
But I think that as an adult now, even now, I feel like I am uncovering things of wounds and hurts and issues in my life are coming to the surface that I know stem back to that relationship and the difficulty of that relationship and his own behavior and attitude. And so that forgiveness and reconciliation doesn't negate the damage and the hurt that's been done. And that damage and that hurt needs to be brought to the surface and healed and recognized and go through all the spiritual healings and things that need to happen. But I think that for me personally, I can go into these type of healings and ruffle up this type of hurt and difficulty in my life with more maybe strength and definitely more grace because I have found forgiveness.
Yes.
I don't think that I can really fully heal as an individual without having forgiven him first.
Right. That's a very difficult topic, to be real honest, the idea of forgiveness, because what does that mean? And there's the idea of I'll forgive but I won't forget. There is some truth to that. You can't really forget those wounds, but your willingness to not let them control you, I think that's ultimately what happens when you forgive, is that you release that from having control over you. What's interesting is that when we do our pre-Cana talks, I have a section of talks that I give which talks about relationships that impact us. And I talk about your mother and your father. And what's fascinating to me is that those early years, let's call it, anywhere from 15 to 18 years, and even oftentimes it could be shorter than that, are so formative that it impacts the person for the rest of their life. And you would think, how can these first few, 10, 12, 15, 18 years really make that big of a difference when I've been with, so to speak, this person here for 30 years?
Right.
Well, what's interesting is that those are such powerful, formative moments for a young man and a young woman that ultimately that's what they saw when it came to conflict. That's what they saw when it came to resolution with conflict. What they saw is kind of became like the bedrock, the code, if you will, for them to understand, here's what I do when I'm unhappy. Here's how I process difficulty. Here's what I say when someone says something hurtful to me. And you kind of learn these patterns. It's all you see for 15 years. And then you show up in a marriage scenario where those patterns are kind of repeating themselves because it's what you go back to. It's all you have to go back to. And so in some ways, for couples who are trying to deal with the past, they'll never be able to deal with that and change it if they don't shine the light and see where it came from, how they were susceptible to those patterns of behavior, and then intentionally choose a new path to go down when they encounter a difficulty.
Right. And I think that ultimately for anybody who's listening, who's dealing with this, the ultimate goal would be to help that person bring these things to the surface, find healing in themselves, forgiveness for the person who's offended, and to seek reconciliation with that person if that's possible.
Right.
And there's certainly situations that are so hurtful, so difficult, so dark that reconciliation may seem impossible, or the other person is not looking for that reconciliation. Sure. But again, I come back to what a beautiful testimony that with you and your dad. I remember when we were young, first dating, the hurt. There was definitely a wound there for you. The difficulty with your dad and the turn that it took in your relationship with him when we were early married. And it's just, to me, a beautiful testimony, not only of your heart and desire to find value in a relationship that you felt caused a lot of injury for you, but also it's a beautiful testimony of your dad and his willingness. And I think that your dad's example is a rare example.
Sure.
That where he says, okay, he's strong enough to acknowledge that his actions caused you hurt. Even though it's painful for him to hear these things, he's willing to let you say your piece. And he's looking to find reconciliation there. And you've moved on to a beautiful relationship, and his relationship with our children and even our grandchildren. It's been a great experience, and so grateful. But that just screams the reasoning for reconciliation.
Yeah, I love that
relationship.
I think that was very well stated, actually. I don't know if I could do much better than that. I mean, ultimately, I remember sitting with my dad, and we were having some sort of a meal. He had occasionally, when I was doing an event in his area, he would drive me to it so we could just have that time in the car together. And then after the event, which he wouldn't usually come into, he'd sit in the car and work or something, we would go out for a lunch or a dinner and just spend that time fellowshipping. And it seemed like for much of my life, my father would go back to some of those earlier years and the difficulties and the divorce, and he would try, I think, his best to, I don't think he was ever trying to explain away anything. I think he was just trying to explain his process, his reasoning, which may not have satisfied me for the majority of my life, but at least for him, he had the chance and the freedom to share that. And I remember thinking to myself, I could spend the rest of my life just being upset with him if I wanted to. And as a young boy who was hurt by the divorce of my parents, that would be justifiable. But I realized ultimately the only person I'm hindering and harming is myself. Ultimately, my father is he said something to me once that was so telling. He said, there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't think about could have I done it differently? How could have I done it differently? How could have I done it so that you weren't hurt and Carrie wasn't hurt? And I realized that for his entire life, he had just agonized over this choice and the impact it had on his children. And I realized I would never want that on a single person. I don't care what, just to live in that kind of agony and regret and constant self-analysis. And so I realized, for me, forgiveness was good for both of us. And what was kind of cool is that the relationship became something that I never imagined. So I said to him one day, as we were sitting having this dinner, and I said, Dad, we don't have to keep talking about the divorce anymore. I said, it was a bummer that you weren't there for me as a kid. But honestly, I want to spend the rest of my life getting to know you. And that's really kind of what we've done, is that we've become very close. It's a wonderful experience to sit with each other. And as he gets older, I'm cherishing each of these moments, knowing that, none of us are guaranteed those additional moments. And
Right.
It brings to mind your father, where I think ultimately we had come to a place where we could really begin. In a way, it was like we had come to a place where we could begin a relationship, but it was so far near the end of his journey
Right.
that there was no place to go. And so it was nice to know I've let go the resentment and the angerness and the bitterness. We're praying for you as you enter eternity. And that was a beautiful way to end that.
Right.
But for me, it's been kind of exciting to think, yes, we got to that point of let's let go of the resentment and the angerness and the bitter, and now what do we do? And for all of those people out there that are able to communicate with your parents, it is worth the effort. It might take you 10, 15 years to figure out, how do I communicate without having an argument? But it's worth it to kind of maneuver that minefield and find those areas. Here's 3 things that we can talk about that we never have a problem with. Here's 2 things that that we can do together. Because if you keep trying to fight for the thing that always is the springboard into an argument, then you're never going to have any type of peace and resolution.
Right. And I know there's some maybe out there who feel like their parents are such a bad influence. They can't have them around their own children. You have to be very protective on how you interact with them, because
Yeah.
it really is a dangerous situation. But so maybe the interaction would be so minor and so small, but it's still worth the effort to find some type of common ground, some type of forgiveness and reconciliation, and ultimately praying for them and praying for their soul. And that really, in the end, we want our parents to know God and to love God and to come to peace themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. I mean, really, ask yourself this question: how has your resentment and bitterness helped at all?
Right.
What has that done for you over the years? And my guess is it's done nothing except for increase your possibility for ulcers and anxiety and the difficulties that you've had. You gotta figure out a way to let that go. And if it's possible for you to make reconciliation, then try and see what can happen. But you can never look back and say, oh, that hurt wasn't hurtful. That's not what I'm saying.
No, right.
And I think when it comes to matters of abuse, certain things like that, you have to keep away. I think you just give it to the Lord and say, Lord, I can't be around this person without it being a trigger for me with such pain, such resentment, such difficulty. So I offer you this ache. And maybe that's the best that you can do. But that's a beautiful gift to give to Jesus, all that pain, all that suffering.
And it's a beautiful gift to give to your own children.
Yes.
Because you're mimicking your relationship with
Right.
your parents is mimicking that in front of your own children.
Yeah, I think it's hard because, especially from the perspective of being a child, to look at your parents and see their behavior to be anything less than parental is a very huge frustration. So you find, I think as you get older sometimes, that you as an adult, as a parent, can be far more mature than the selfishness and the childish behavior of an adult who seems to constantly be bringing up the past or still living in resentment and bitterness. And unfortunately, I think for your father, he lived in a place of just constant bitterness, which, by the way, interestingly enough, the people that impacted were his family more than anything else.
Right.
So you have to be careful about that too. Holding on to bitterness can sometimes harm and hurt the people that you want to love.
Right, because you're right. His bitterness fed into our whole family dynamic, and as well as us as children, our bitterness can feed into our whole family dynamic. So let the bitterness go and find reconciliation.
Yes. Long and the short of it, my friends, is that we know that every situation is a little bit different and unique. And so we're not pretending that this is the blanket statement answer for everybody's scenario.
Certainly.
So know that we're cheering you on and that we're praying for you. Know that to have a heart of forgiveness is to have the heart of Christ. And ultimately, we're here to encourage you in any way we can. If you want to talk about this, if there's a story you want to share, feel free to send in an email, Linda at CatholicFam.org or Chris at CatholicFam.org. God bless you guys. Know that we're cheering you on.